On February 20th, the ground beneath Sicily has not finished moving. A criminal investigation is underway. More than €1 billion in emergency funding has already been pledged. Over 2,000 people cannot return to their homes. And the story of how this happened is not the story of a storm. It is the story of a town that was ignored long before the rain began to fall. But here is the detail that tells the real story. A stone cross carved into rock and mounted on a marble pedestal had stood for nearly 3 decades in the Santa Croce district of Sicily. It was erected in memory of a church destroyed by the landslide of 1997. For weeks after January 25th, that cross sat meters from a new abyss. News crews photographed it. It circulated across Italian media as a symbol of survival and resistance. On February 9th, the ground beneath it gave way. The cross fell into the void. It took a police robot to retrieve it from the ravine 6 days later in pieces. That cross is now in the hands of the mayor. The symbol survived. The earth it stood on did not. To understand how Sicily arrived here, you have to watch the timeline accelerate. On January 16th, the first landslide ripped apart Provincial Road 12, the main artery connecting Sicily to the state road network. 35 families were evacuated. The mayor looked at the crack in the earth and understood immediately that the first slide was not the story. The story was what came next. On January 19th, strong weather conditions moved in. Between January 20th and 21st, Mediterranean storm Harry made landfall and dumped more than 300 millimeters of rainfall onto southern Sicily in just 48 hours. That is roughly equivalent to an entire year's worth of rain, compressed into 2 days. On January 25th, at 1 in the afternoon on a quiet Sunday, the second landslide tore open a 4-kilometer gash along the western and southern edge of town. 500 people fled with whatever they could carry. Cars dangled over a newly formed cliff edge. The image circled the globe. And this was only the beginning. By January 26th, Italy's Council of Ministers declared a state of emergency across Sicily, Sardinia, and Calabria, and allocated an initial €100 million. On January 28th, Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni arrived by helicopter. Civil Protection Chief Fabio Siciliano stood in front of cameras and delivered a verdict that no one wanted to hear. The entire hill, he said, is collapsing onto the plain of Gela. Some houses on the edge of the landslide can never be occupied again. The next day, Siciliano appeared on national television and put a number to the catastrophe that stunned even the experts. Approximately 350 million cubic meters of earth had been displaced. For comparison, the 1963 Vajont disaster moved 263 million cubic meters and killed nearly 2,000 people. Sicily moved more earth than Vajont. No one died here. Not because the geology was kinder, but because the evacuation was fast. Then came the part that changed everything about how Italy would respond. On January 31st, a 3-story building in the Santa Croce neighborhood collapsed on the ridge. The landslide was not slowing down. It was eating the town from underneath. Sicily sits in the province of Caltanissetta in south-central Sicily, roughly 25 kilometers inland from the coastal city of Gela. A town of 25,000 people built on a plateau at 330 meters elevation, overlooking the fertile plain and the Mediterranean beyond. That plateau is the problem. It rests on thick layers of clay and sand, sedimentary deposits that hold their shape when dry but transform into a structureless, moving paste when saturated. Below the town, the terrain descends in eroded slopes toward the Maroglio River Valley. Gravity has been pulling Sicily toward that valley for generations. And here is what no one in power seemed to act on. Sicily was classified as R4. That is the highest geological risk level in Italy. That classification did not appear after Storm Harry. It existed before the landslide. It existed before this decade. It existed for years, documented, known, and filed. Giovanna Papalardo, professor of applied geology at the University of Catania, issued a stark warning as the disaster unfolded. The situation, she said, is repeating itself from 1997 with even more significant characteristics. The landslide front now extends roughly 4 kilometers and directly affects houses facing the slope. And here is the fact that seals it. Of the 46 hydrogeological risk projects funded through Italy's National Recovery Plan across all of Sicily, not a single one concerned Niscemi. In 9 years, no municipal administration submitted a single project request on behalf of this town to the commissioner structure responsible for managing those funds. A town classified at the highest possible risk level, left entirely outside the funding pipeline designed to prevent exactly this kind of disaster. Provincial roads 10 and 12, the two main connections to the state road network, are both gone. That leaves Provincial Road 11 as the only route in or out of Niscemi. 25,000 people. One road. Francesca Aparo was in bed with a fever when the landslide struck on January 25th. She had survived this before. In 1997, her father's house was destroyed by the previous landslide. The family rebuilt. They moved to the historic center near the Belvedere overlooking the plain. 28 years later, her new home now stands near another landslide zone and faces possible demolition by government order. For the second time in her life, the earth is taking everything she built. This is where it gets harder. Salvatore Vela, chief prosecutor of Gela, has opened a criminal investigation into negligent disaster and damage. On February 12th, 3 geology professors from the University of Palermo conducted the first formal judicial inspection of the landslide front, accompanied by magistrates and police. Vela told reporters his office is examining a substantial body of material, including satellite imagery from the Italian Space Agency. Witness hearings will follow. One thing is certain, he said, no one will be spared scrutiny. The investigation will determine whether countermeasures could have prevented this after 1997, or whether construction and planning decisions in the decades that followed actively worsened the instability. After the 1997 landslide, prosecutors investigated. Every defendant was acquitted. The stabilization work that was promised to the community was divided into phases. Phases 2 and 3 of that 1997 response received their funding in December 2025. 28 years after the disaster they were meant to address. On February 18th, the Italian government announced that total emergency funding now exceeds 1.1 billion euros across the 3 affected regions, with 150 million euros dedicated specifically to Niscemi. A government decree formally appointed Siciliano as Extraordinary Commissioner for Reconstruction. The money will fund demolitions of uninhabitable buildings, safety measures, and the purchase of new properties for displaced families. Prime Minister Meloni returned to Niscemi for a second visit and called it the most closely monitored municipality in Europe. But she also told residents she cannot provide a timeline. The red zone boundaries could still shift. The University of Florence is analyzing satellite data, measuring ground movement over time. The Italian Space Agency has been brought in. Geophysics teams from universities in Catania, Palermo, and Rome are working the site. The ground is still moving. Further rainfall could reactivate the slide. The numbers tell the rest. 350 million cubic meters displaced. Over 2,000 people evacuated. A landslide front stretching beyond 4 kilometers. Hundreds of buildings declared unsafe. Orange groves, olive groves, farms and gardens that had fed families for generations now buried under debris. Damage across Sicily from cyclone, Harry estimated at 2 billion euros. And a criminal investigation that will ask in a court of law whether any of this was preventable. How do you rebuild a town on ground that is still moving? How do you tell 2,000 people that the homes their grandparents built, the streets where they grew up, and the view of the Mediterranean they saw from their kitchen windows will be demolished by government decree? And if a town classified at the highest geological risk level in Italy for years received none of the 46 funded stabilization projects designed to prevent exactly this kind of collapse, how many other towns across this country are waiting for the same earth to move beneath them? The cross was recovered from the bottom of the ravine. It was brought back to the mayor in pieces. The symbol survived. The ground it stood on did not. And now someone is going to have to answer for why no one reinforced that ground before the storm arrived.